Welcome back, AP. All right, welcome back to your second flip about exploration, right? Some of y'all probably being like, man, we didn't even do like notes today in class or the day before that or anything like that. But yeah, we were finishing up our artworks and stuff like that. And also this part of this unit, this exploration part of the first unit is very, very short, right? So we'll able to be getting through it pretty quick. And I was super excited that I got to present on the David and stuff today. It's one of my favorite pieces of art, so I'm really excited that you guys know so much about it now. So, but anyway, getting into it a little bit, we left off in the last flip talking about the arrival of the Spanish, right? So we were going to be talking about the incoming, group of the Spanish. We discussed the technology that was necessary for the Europeans to finally start exploring stuff, including caravels, fly compass, astrolabe. Like, you could also argue cartography and things like that. We talked about how the Portuguese under Henry the Navigator took a really intense strategy to go around Africa to try and get to India to be involved in the spice trade. That was going to be massive, and of course they're going to create little forts and encampments all the way around Africa, and they're also going to get heavily involved in the sugar and slavery industry, which is really messed up, and they're going to be the biggest importers of slaves to the Americas and then also back to Europe as well. They are going to make it, of course, to India under Vasco da Gama. They are going to get halfway there with Bartholomew Diaz, and the Cape of Storms gets renamed the Cape of Good Hope when Vasco da Gama gets all the way past it, right? We also talked a little bit about the monsoon marketplace, talked about early European explorers, Marco Polo, things like that, right? So if you're smart, if I were you, I would go back, maybe like kind of watch that again on like 1.5 speed or something like that, just to kind of get that stuff back up under your belt a little bit, or review it before class tomorrow, because we're going to review a ton of stuff and we're going to dive straight into some other things, right? So, but that was all about the Portuguese, and we left off talking about the Portuguese and how they established like forts and encampments all on around the inside of India. And they're going to actually work and ally with local Indian rulers while bombarding other ones. A big thing about the Portuguese as well is they're actually going to promise a bunch of these Indian leaders that they'll protect them if other white people show up. That was a lie, because the Portuguese military isn't that good, at this time anyway. So the big thing going forward, though, is here comes this guy, right? And everybody apparently knows this guy, right? That is Christopher Columbus, okay? So Christopher Columbus, who is going to sail for the Spanish and be given his money by Isabella and Ferdinand. That's right, the exact same people that did that mean Spanish Inquisition and that forced all these people out of their country under the stewardship of the Catholic Church, but mainly so that they could strip power away from the nobility and kind of usurp authority and grow their monarchical power inside of Spain. This guy, though, apparently may or may not be Columbus. All right, so this is another one of those weird things. We are not sure if we even have a portrait of Columbus. We're not positive if this is him or not. We're not there is no perfect existing commissioned portrait of Columbus, but we think this is him. We're not positive, though. So, fun fact, we don't even know what this dude looks like, but he has a holiday. How dumb is that? Now, anyway, really quick, though, what do we already know about Columbus? Now, typically when I do this, I actually do it in class. We throw it up on the board, and kids usually throw out stuff like, the Nina, the Pinta, the Santa Maria, 1492. He's from Spain. No, he's not. All right, so he's not from Spain. He's actually Italian. All right, so there are some important items. You need to know the year 1492. You do need to know that that's when he's going to be commissioned to go, right? So, and actually try to find this route. You need to understand why he went the direction that he went. He went westward hoping that he was going to pop up on the other side of the earth because he knew it was round, and he was going to then hit Japan and then bounce down around Asia to get to India on the other route, or from going all the way around the world, right? You need to know that Isabella and Ferdinand are the ones who commissioned him to go. You need to know that he's trying to get involved in the spice trade. You need to know that he took 3 vessels and also a bunch of colonists, right? But first, let's talk about his motivation. He's not even Spanish. He's actually Italian, right? So he's Italian, and he's from that city-state, Genoa, the one that has a massive rivalry with Venice, right? So a big part of his motivation was that he was trying to incorporate and make his homeland of Genoa look better, be more prominent in this ideas of trading and infrastructure. And he actually went to the Genoese government first to get permission to go on a voyage. He was like, hey, Genoa, I got an idea. Let's go west and pop up on the other side of the planet, and we'll get to India that way. And Genoa was like, no, that sounds like a terrible investment. And then he also went back to several other Italian kingdoms. And then he went to Spain, right? He eventually went to Spain, and he was like, Isabella and Ferdinand, I got a great plan. And Ferdinand didn't want to give him the money, but Isabella kind of wore the pants in that relationship, and she legit was just like, okay, that's fine. We'll give you the money and the boats. We'll give you 3 of our vessels, 3 of our caravels, and we'll give you the boats, and we'll give you some men, and you can go out that way. But 90% of whatever you find belongs to us, and you only get 10%, Columbus, right? So, and of course, in the grand scheme of things, he's thinking to himself, I'm one guy, 10%. That's a lot of money. So he's very, very excited. And what he becomes is the first wave of these people known as conquistadors, right? So conquistadors are Spanish conquerors or Spanish explorers, quote unquote. And fun fact, it's actually the reason why Spanish moss is called Spanish moss. Spanish moss on the trees is actually called Spanish moss because Spanish conquistadors, a lot of them had beards, and it's how the Native Americans described the stuff on the trees and the Spanish people to French people. So it became known as Spanish moss, right? Imitating their beards. Now, really quick though, when he gets to the new world, quote unquote, after getting lost like 3 times, he thought he was in Asia, right? He thought he was in Asia. He actually landed in the Caribbean. He did not land in North America. He never once stepped foot in what is known now as the United States of America. So get that out of your mind completely. I had a kid last year who said, didn't you discover Plymouth? Ugh! Now, anyway, but he used Christianity to enslave a nonviolent group of people that he came into contact with. He actually landed in the Bahamas, to be very, very specific. The people that he came into contact with are known as the Taino people, right? And the really messed up thing about this whole situation is the Taino people were super peaceful to him at first. They were like, oh, you have all these amazing pieces of technology. You have these giant boats, you have this armor, you have these swords, you have these guns, you have all this stuff. You have these horses that I've never seen before, where it's just like that thing's got a dude riding on his back. This is crazy. Want to trade? So, and Columbus was like, no, we're going to give you Jesus and then make you work for us for forever. And a lot of this has to do with a lot of different things. This is actually what we believe to be Columbus's signatures. Big thing, though, is he was very gold hungry, right? And a lot of it actually is believed to have been inspired by, one, that contract that he had with Isabella and Ferdinand, the fact that he was going to get 10% of anything he found, right? And then also, another big component of it is because apparently he saw native Taino people there wearing gold jewelry, right? And he asked them, he was like, do you have a lot more of that lying around, this jewelry? Do you have more of that? Is that nearby? And they were like, well, we have some. We have like a little bit of this stuff in the dirt. Not much, though. There are these other people, though, over the water that way that have tons of it. And he's referring to the Aztecs. Oh, God. The Taino people were talking about the Aztecs. And it stinks because that puts a little kind of idea in the Spanish people's heads that there is a massively wealthy country or civilization inside of what is now known as modern-day Mexico. And we'll get to that here in the second part of this flip. Now, the big thing, though, is he was very gold hungry. He planned on meeting the Great Khan when he actually got to where he was going. He thought he was going to meet the descendants of Genghis Khan on the coasts of China and Japan, even though, ironically enough, Mongolia didn't own those areas anymore, so it shows you how smart Columbus was when it comes to geopolitics. And then also, he then eventually adopts a policy of conquest. He then begins to force the natives to work for him by mining gold or gathering resources as much as possible. There are stories that say that if they did not fill a bell, like the top of a bell, with gold dust by a certain time, that their hands would be cut off, right? There are stories that talk about them being fed to Spanish war dogs, them being actually like assaulted and injured and violently abused by the conquistadors while Columbus allowed it. So after he left the Bahamas, he then went to Hispaniola, where he also met more Taino people. And another big thing that happened is all of the Taino natives started dying. And they just started dying massively fast. And it's mainly due to the fact that, unbeknownst to Columbus, he was spreading disease. 3 big diseases that the Taino and the Native Americans had never come into contact with, the Spanish had with them, and they didn't even know it. Those 3 diseases include smallpox, measles, and influenza, right? Amongst many, many others. Now, the colonists, though, this is not me saying that Columbus is like off the hook. But a big thing that happens sometimes is when we know that a person was like not what they seem to be in history, people kind of begin to point the finger at that person and then take it really, really, really a long way, right? And he does deserve a lot of blame. But the colonists that he brought with him were even worse than he was, right? And a lot of it has to do with the fact that he left, right? He left to go back to Isabella and Ferdinand in Spain after his first voyage. And when he came back, he brought gifts from this new land that he discovered. He thought he was like right next door to Asia. Like legit, the dude thought he was like right next by China the entire time. And when he went back, he brought a bunch of Taino people as gifts for Isabella and Ferdinand. What the heck? That's super messed up. And actually literally enslaved these people and brought them back as like presents, right? While he was gone, though, he left one of his brothers in charge, right? And the big thing about it is he did not give his brother rules and regulations to regulate the colonists when he left. So when he came back, the colony was in an uproar, and he couldn't stop people from committing violence against natives. And a revolt broke out when him and his brother arrested a few of the colonists to get them to stop like murdering and assaulting and destroying the native communities. A revolt broke out because he arrested them, put them on trial with no real jury, and then sentenced them to be executed, right? And this was on like his third voyage. So the big thing too about Columbus is he only ever went there like 4 times. Like he only ever went to the New World like 4 different times. And like a couple of times, like he bounced around. He stepped foot in what is now modern-day Mexico for like 5 minutes because he was like, "Oh, we're gonna go to me." Like so, but a revolt broke out. The colonists revolted against him, and a royal investigation had to be called. And he was arrested. Like Columbus returned back to Spain in chains. And when he died, he thought he was right next door to China like the entire time, right? So, and he died kind of with a bad reputation. So even ironically enough, we give this man a holiday, but the Spanish king and queen that were alive that gave him the money had him arrested and brought back, and he died legit in kind of penniless disgrace, right? So, but control of his discoveries because of this revolt and because of this mismanagement of these new areas he discovered is going to pass to the royals, right? And he died thinking, like I said, that China was just right around the corner, right? Now, this entire movement by him, though, is going to be a catalyst for later explorers and bigger movements, right? So you've got 2 spheres right now. You got the Portuguese over in India that are going around Africa, right? And you got the Spanish that are over in the quote-unquote New World, which is actually not really that new, considering the fact that the natives discovered it first. Now, the big thing, though, is that they were over there trying to adopt this policy of conquest and conquer and resource allocation. So the thing that's going to happen, though, is on the eastern side of the planet, you're going to see the infiltration of several different people into that East Asiatic community. Now, one of those areas was known as the Moluccas Islands, right? So these right here, and also known as the Moluccas Islands, apparently, especially Java was a really, really big one, are like legit right next to India. Like India's right here. So the Dutch knew that they didn't have the power at the time to be able to actually go and take India from the Portuguese. So they decided to set up camp on the Moluccas Islands, aka the Spice Islands, which actually grew a heavy amount of spices as well. So the Dutch are beginning a conquest of the Indian Ocean, which is very important, with their wooden shoes and the hinga-dinga-durgan. All right, so even though, ironically enough, that's probably more like Norwegian. So really quick, though, also just so you know, speaking of the Dutch are from the Netherlands. If you didn't know that already, now you know, okay? People from the Netherlands are also known as Dutch, all right? So the big thing, though, is that they're beginning exploration movements because they're actually fighting a war currently against the Spanish crown to try and actually get its independence, right? So also what's going to end up going on, though, is you're going to see the arrival of someone else, Amerigo Vespucci. Amerigo Vespucci was an Italian cartographer. He's a map maker that was sent by the Spanish government to go to North America to create the maps, thinking that they were like, oh, well, India's got to be right around the corner, right? These are like just a few islands. It's got to just be a few large islands. And then when we figure out, let's send a map maker. So they send Amerigo Vespucci to go over there and make the maps of this newly discovered territory so they can figure out where the heck in the world they are so they can get over to India still. So the Spanish still hadn't even given this idea up. They were like, nah, like China, right over there. India, right over there, right? And funny enough, Amerigo Vespucci is not the guy that really, did all of the maps. He gets the, credit for being the guy that made all the maps of North America. That's not actually true. What he actually did was that he was the first to realize that it was 2 continents, not an island, right? So when he finds this discovery and sends word back, he ends up garnering the credit for realizing that these places are 2 continents, and it's why the Americas are named America because of Amerigo Vespucci, right? Now we've got an issue, though. Because up until Amerigo Vespucci, everybody thought that basically, wait a second, the Spanish are like doorsteps away from India, right? It's probably going to lead to a war between them and Portugal. They're next door neighbors. Hopefully it'll be localized in Europe. But what ends up happening, though, is now that Amerigo Vespucci has discovered the fact that North America and South America are two independent continents, well, sort of, they're connected, but then now what? That means that, like, a whole group of countries are going to want this and this, right? So some people are going to want the Americas, some people are going to want, the Indian sphere, the Eastern Hemisphere. So the Treaty of Tortosius gets signed by Portugal and by Spain, and it was written by the Pope. And the Pope that wrote it was Alexander VI, right? So, and when he wrote it, the Treaty of Tortosius said, all right, Spain, you get the left side, all the new continent stuff, and Portugal, you get the right side, all of the India stuff, right? That's what you each get. Got it? You do not get to go after each other's stuff. And when he did that, basically the Pope effectively drew a line that went straight down the planet. And I'll show you what it would have looked like really, really quick. World map. So basically, in a nutshell, the Pope, Alexander VI, was just like this. And he's kind of like that not that Home Alone, but that Full House episode where Stephanie and DJ have to like separate the room with a big line. And they're like, you can't come over here, right? And so the Treaty of Tordesillas line was drawn just like that, right? And it said, Spain, you get this stuff. And Portugal, you get this stuff, right? And this was to prevent them going to war with one another. Now, why would the Pope want to get involved in cross-sea and multicultural economics? Why would he want to get involved in preventing these two groups of people from going to war with each other? Well, the reason why he wanted to get involved is because if Spain starts making a buttload of money, and if Portugal starts making a buttload of money, that means that the tithe is going to increase, so the Catholic Church stands to make a lot of money. So by preventing them from going to war and wasting money, this was an economic move, right? And with that in totality, he was also trying to prevent large-scale war from breaking out in the continent of Europe. So also preserving peace as well, but it was also an economic move. But also, as you can see, the line got screwed up when they drawed it, and they didn't draw it, when they drew it, and they didn't realize that Brazil came out this far, so they accidentally cut the tip of it off, and so Portugal was technically allowed to go and settle this area right there. And so they did, and that's why Brazil speaks Portuguese instead of Spanish, right? So, because they actually were the ones that settled this area. Mainly also, too, the Spanish didn't want to go through this stuff right here, because that's the Amazon rainforest. It's really scary, and it's very dark there. Now, anyway, really, really quick, though. So going forward, also, there's yellow fever and malaria and a bunch of other stuff. But that line is known as the line of demarcation. That line that went down the planet was like, all right, this is the line of demarcation. Spain, you get that. Portugal, you get that. Now, another very famous figure that shows up in 1519 is a guy named Ferdinand Magellan. Ferdinand Magellan is going to decide that he wants to go all the way around the earth. Ferdinand Magellan, a Portuguese sailor, decides that he wants to go like, all right, so, and hit this point, and he wants to eventually get all the way back to Portugal. The reason why I went, is because due to the fact that when he got this far, he almost died, right? Like, so his voyages actually hit a giant patch of storms and chaotic water right here. And then when they came out to this side, he actually was like, oh my God, this water is so calm and so peaceful. I shall call it the Pacific. That's why it's called the Pacific Ocean, because it's peaceful water. Magellan named it that. But anyway, so then he continues his voyage, and then he starts just going, oh, hey, Philippines, and dead. All right, so something that a lot of people don't understand is that Magellan actually have never made it around all the entire planet. He died in the Philippines, and his body made it all the way back to Portugal, but his head was separated from his shoulders. And so the rest of the voyage was actually finished by his crew on this side. And we believe that actually one of the only members of his crew that actually did go all the way around the planet was probably an African slave. So actually one of the first people to ever go all the way around the earth was actually African. So, like, in a big thing, though, yeah, Magellan died right here. But his voyage was the first to circumnavigate the globe. So circumnavigation is a good word when it actually comes to Magellan. And now, just a heads up, too, another big thing that's going to happen is that the English and the French are going to try to get in on this as well. A lot of this has to do with the fact that they are the most big, like, they were for a long time before Spain discovers these lands, are the economic powerhouses throughout Europe. And they decide that they want to get involved. But they can't go to where Spain is. They have to secretly, mainly not the English so much. The English don't have to hide whatsoever. The English are like, I don't have to listen to the Pope. We're Protestant now. Thank you, Henry VIII. And we'll get to that stuff in the next unit. But they end up going and discovering, or not discovering, but exploring and trying to put like some simple colonies and areas in what is now known as North Carolina. And they get over there, though, and it doesn't go very well. They end up losing a colony. The Roanoke colony gets completely lost, right? So, but also, even their earliest voyages didn't pan out really well, and neither did the French's, right? They didn't go well at all. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that the climate of North America was too harsh, and they couldn't actually live there, whereas the Spanish were in the Caribbean, where it was proficiently warm all the time. So the earliest French explorations went terribly, and the only things they found that they wanted to make any money off from 1490 to 1570 was actually beavers and codfish. All right, so like the French got heavily involved in fur trading. They would actually send fur trappers over there, single men by themselves, to go over there, hunt different furs, and bring them back to France, because that was becoming a burgeoning economy and a big cash crop. And then also codfish. Codfish were heavily discovered off the coast of North America, and codfish are kind of this really, really huge, meaty fish. And actually, there's a whole book about it. It's like something about the codfish. Apparently, they're super important. Now, codfish, though, became a staple crop and a staple food source for almost everybody in Europe, because the amount of it discovered off the coast of North America by the French and the English, right? So they didn't even start colonizing yet. Colonization was not a thing that they were worried about. But the Spanish are going to adopt this concept of conquest, right? So, all right, we got a little bit more. We got about 10 more minutes, and then we're going to be done, okay? So the Spanish, while the English are trying to figure out some colonies, while the French are just hunting beaver, right? So, and all this other stuff, the Spanish decide that they want to find out what Columbus was told, if it's true or not. They want to find out if those Aztecs over in Mexico have all this gold and stuff like that. So they decide to start getting a voyage together, to go out there and do just simple recon. Just recon. We're going to send some guys we trust out there, and they're going to go over there, and they're going to see if there's actually all this gold and stuff. And if there is, then we'll come back and we'll figure it out, right? Well, the guy that wasn't picked for the job was Hernando Cortez, right? Hernando Cortez, or Hernan Cortez, was actually passed over for this job. But the guy that was picked for the job the day before the event happened mysteriously showed up murdered. Right? So that's really, really rough. Hernan Cortez and the pursuit of gold is going to be a massive event that occurs because this dude showed up murdered. And all the boats that the guy that was supposed to go do the recon, they were all gone. All gone. That's really rough stuff. And he was only taking 600 men, 16 horses, and 10 cannons. That's not enough stuff to go and take over what is actually known as now the Mexican Empire. So something you need to understand is that the Aztecs are massive. They're a very large group of people. Huge, actually. Gigantic, if you will. So we don't even really just call them the Aztecs anymore. We actually call them the Mexica, right? So, or not the Mexica. We call the lands they took over the Mexican Empire, and we call the people the Aztecs. And here's the reason why I'm harping on all this stuff a little bit. Hernan Cortez did not have enough stuff to go and take them over. He was not prepared for all this shenanigans. He only took 600 men, 16 horses, 3 boats, and 10 cannons. And when he landed there, he burnt, never mind, we'll get all that stuff. But also, the reason why I'm saying he didn't have enough stuff is because this is what the Aztecs were making. Good Lord. Look at that stuff. Like, Tenochtitlan is their capital. Their capital city was like a modern-day Rome. It had over 1 million people in it. The Aztecs are not dumb. They were actually a very advanced civilization. The reason why, we'll get to it here in a minute, that the Aztecs would be considered weaker than the Spanish and things like that, a lot of it has to do with 2 things. But look at this! The Aztecs legit had their capital city, Tenochtitlan, built on top of a lake. They, according to prophecy, were told to build there by their gods because they were apparently told that they would see a snake being clutched in the talons of an eagle standing on top of a cactus when they knew where to settle. And that's why that symbol is inside the Mexican flag, and it's where they built their city on top of this giant lake, right? So they actually, well, wait a second, Mr. Terry. How do you build on top of a lake? The Aztecs built islands. I'm going to say that again. The Aztecs had man-made islands. These things are called chinampas, right? So chinampas. And chinampas are a genius little concept that the Aztecs developed so they could build on top of water. And basically the way it worked is you would legit create all these little mud and reed pats, right? These mats. And so basically you took reeds and you wove them together, right? Like a big mat. And then they would slap mud on top of it. And then they would take another reed and mat and slap that on top. And then mud and there. And then slap reed, mud, reed, mud, reed, mud. And then it would actually float, right? And now with all the mud, you could grow things on top of it. But how do you keep it from floating around all over the place? These guys right here, right? They would plant a tree in the corners of the actual man-made islands, and the tree's roots would go and then go all the way down to the bottom of the lake and anchor it into place. The tree's roots would actually go into the lake bottom and like root itself in, and they legitimately farmed on top of islands. That is insane. They are so sophisticated. Also, here's the big reason why the Spanish would have had a chance against the Aztecs in the long run, mainly due to the fact that they lacked a couple things. So something that you have to understand about the Aztecs is that they would have been able to give the Spanish a run for their money, and they would have been able to keep them out, and they would have been able to like just maybe possibly triumph over them in totality if they had access to like two other things, right? They didn't have forgeable metals. As you can see right here, they actually had still what you would call primitive weapons. Now, interestingly enough, though, these primitive weapons gave them the ability to take over other villages that surrounded them. Massive, massive area, and that's why they're called the Mexica Empire, right? What their blades are made out of right here is lava glass, obsidian. They actually took lava, like actual, like, not molten, but like, what's it called? Obsidian, which is like hardened lava, right, that has actually come from a volcanic eruption. They chipped away at it to create lava, like to create shards of glass that they would then put inside of spears and swords. And they used those weapons to go off and take over this entire area. So as you can see, Tenochtitlan is right there, and all these other villages they took over using these weapons. But if you take an obsidian weapon and bang it against a steel sword from a Spaniard, the obsidian one's going to shatter, right? So they had enough weaponry to take over all these people, but not enough to hold the Mexica back. Now, here's the other thing, or the Spanish back. Also, the other thing they lacked, jot this down, they lacked forgeable metals and domesticated animals, right? Without domesticated animals, they weren't getting diseases that the Spanish already had. Domesticated animals give us things like smallpox, measles, influenza. Viruses come from the domestication of animals and the fact that we now as human beings are susceptible to them because we are not supposed to be around animals as much as we are, right? And then actually these viruses have mutated over time and made it so they could attack us. Well, the Aztecs never had access or never actually came into contact with these viruses because they never domesticated animals, right? And so when the Spanish show up, smallpox, measles, influenza, that's the thing Cortez had with him that he had in his back pocket that he never even realized, was the fact that smallpox was going to do more work for him than actual weapons were. But when the Aztec did take over all this stuff before the Spanish even arrived, all these villages that they took over, who weren't Aztec inside of their empire, were forced to pay a tax to Tenochtitlan. And it made all of these villages hate the Aztecs. They hated them because that tax was in the form of people to be sacrificed to their gods, right? To their main god, Quetzalcoatl, who is this white serpent god of destruction, right? And to keep him at bay and to keep crops growing, it was believed by the Aztecs that you had to cut the heart out of out of a sacrificial person who were all taken from these areas right here. And so when this occurred, they would pull the heart out and actually like watch it beat and then stick it inside of one of these bad boys, a jaguar jar. And they would sometimes apparently like actually sacrifice hundreds of people a day. And this is their leader. Jot this down. His name is Moctezuma, right? So Moctezuma, also known as Montezuma apparently as well. Actually goes both ways. Now, the other big thing, though, is that the mission, again, was supposed to just be recon. Cortez was supposed to show up and just meet these people, hoping that they could figure out and scope them out to see if that they could destroy them in battle later. But Cortez is nuts. He legit burned his ships in the harbor, and also there's the story about these gifts, right? So Cortez, when he arrived, burned his ships, basically telling his men, we're not going home, because if I do, I'm probably going to be arrested for murder because I killed the guy that's supposed to be in charge of this thing, Also, if we go back, we're not going back without our wealth and conquest, right? So Cortez knew in the back of his mind he could not return back to Cuba, which is where he was coming from, without success and conquest. So he actually burned his ships after they docked them, right? And then also, he had an interpreter with him. Actually, he had two interpreters with him. So one was a female Aztec, or a female native who could speak Maya and Aztec. And then he also had a drunk Spanish priest that could speak Maya and Spanish, right? So basically, he had to talk to two people just to talk to one Aztec. But what ends up happening when they arrive on the shores, the Aztecs are not dumb. They heard they were coming. And so they sent gifts, right? Gifts to try and maybe possibly pan things out, prevent violence from erupting. Cortez abused the dissension with the Mexican Empire and also took the gifts and then followed the gift givers back to the Tenochtitlan. Cortez, while on his way to Tenochtitlan, stopped at all these different villages and made alliances with them. He was like, oh, they've been sacrificing you this whole time? That's sad. Well, how about you team up with me and we'll take the Aztecs down? Cortez is one of the worst people in all of history. And so now he's got an army of 200 Spanish, 6,000 natives, and those two interpreters, right? Montezuma, knowing what was happening, welcomed the Spanish into Tenochtitlan. Cortez, though, after negotiations broke down, took Montezuma hostage, right? Brought him out onto a balcony and told the Aztec people, if you do not give me what I want, which is your gold and your resources, I'm going to kill your king, right? And the Aztecs were like, wait a minute, that king guy, Montezuma's supposed to be like a living god, right? If he's a living god, he would have never allowed Cortez to take advantage of him like this. So he must not actually be a god. Kill him. And the Aztecs picked up rocks and started throwing them at him and killed their own king and then drove the Spanish out completely. But Cortez would return a second time with more natives, and a smallpox outbreak from their original arrival had destroyed over half the population of the city. And Spain took it over completely and burned most of it to the ground. So we're going to leave off right there, and then tomorrow in class we're going to pick up on Pizarro and his conquests of Peru. All right, so we'll talk about that soon. Y'all have a good one.